Welcome back. Well, that and it did raise several other issues, not just that. I mean, talking about COVID-19, but, well, to take a look at that and a lot more, we've got Mr. Clement Wankwo this morning. He's the Executive Director of PLAC, that's a Policy and Legal Advocacy Network. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Well, looking at that report and some of those videos that made the rounds and still made the rounds, even not captured in the report because there's so many of them. You know, one wonders, how do you deal with those kind of issues, particularly at this time?
Well, I think it's sad that we currently have a crisis. Virtually everyone is a victim of this crisis, and it means that everyone is under pressure to cope with the circumstances that we're all in. It puts a burden on those who have responsibility for helping to address this issue, to treat everyone else with dignity and with respect. And that's why the question of respect for human rights is really very important. And when you have regulations made under the current environment, the whole idea is that the regulations are actually very intended to be persuasive, intended to help people to change behavior to adapt to the current circumstances in order to all work as a team to overcome the challenge that we're in. So when you see the levels of human rights violations that are going on, then you get the sense that there is a failure of understanding on the responsibility of those who have enforcement obligations to respect the rights of people. And I think reorientation, training and better understanding of what the real rules should be for enforcement officials is very key and important.
No, what really baffles a lot of people at times like this is why? Why do we have issues such as this from state actors? You know, I can go on and on, maybe police, you know, and other, you know, security officials. The question is, I know you have done a lot of research into this. What is usually at the heart of this?
Well, one, I think it's training, it's orientation. When we look at law enforcement officials and look at some of the what they have inherited from the past, from colonial rule, you would see that the original intention of creating them was to suppress and enforce colonial orders. A lot of that has changed, which means that we've come a long way since 1960 that Nigeria became independent. So we can't continue to look back and blame colonialists. A lot needs to have been done that have not been done. And that's why we've been advocating for a very, very long time. Today you have in place a 1942 law that creates the Nigeria police, and it still calls itself police force. You have the Quarantine Act, which is a 1918 legislation. All of the training that seeks to brutalize, that seeks to enforce, that seeks to subjugate, those are the things that need to change in terms of the way state officials happen to deal with citizens and respond to the need to work with citizens. So I think the democratic culture, the civility that needs to be in place is absent, and a lot needs to be done to bring that on board and ensure that state officials respect this.
Come back to some of those legislation, obsolete as they may sound in a bit, but let me just put this to you. You've been at the forefront of fighting for, you know, the rights of people for very, very many years. On the one hand is the law, is the instructions, the regulations that governments and various levels of authorities give. On the other hand is the people who do not abide by those laws, those regulations, knowing what government has said, don't move around, don't travel interstate and all of that, and people still flout those laws. How do we, sometimes it's difficult to enforce these laws, you know, when people know what to do and they do not do it. How do we balance that?
Well, like I said, the institutions of states, our processes, our systems need to catch up with the current reality. First of all, you do have a very poor population. As you know, the reputation of Nigeria at this time is that it's the poverty capital of the world. So when regulations are made, and for a lot of people who are lawyers and a lot of us who went through law school, you are told that the laws must be in sync with the way of life of a people, and where the standards of the law are far in excess of what the standards of the people are, then you're going to have a challenge with respect for it. Of course, there is a responsibility on citizens to be disciplined. There is a responsibility on citizens to respect the law. But a lot of times, as you do have in the current situation with the restrictions under COVID-19, that people are also battling with a system that completely leaves them on their own. There is no state mechanism. There is no national social security system that provides for its people. So when people have to get up in the morning and go to work and earn a living to feed themselves and their family, and they can't do that the next day, and there are no support mechanisms to help them to feed the next day, because there are people who cannot afford to eat the next meal. I listened to the Minister of Health in the inaugural press briefing that they had, and he was responding to a question, and he said, "Oh, you should have known by now that the government was going to enforce a lockdown." And I know people who have been able to provide for themselves 1 year ahead. I was a bit surprised by that comment. But the reality is there are people who cannot afford to provide for themselves 1 day ahead because they just don't have the means. And that's the question. What can the state do to support such people? And in the absence of that support mechanism, it means that you are going to have to struggle on the balance between trying to survive and respecting the regulation. And that's the challenge that we are faced with at this time.
By what you just said now, that the authorities are not in touch with the realities of what the people are going through before these regulations come aboard?
I think that people are going through different difficulties. I think people are starving. I think people are impoverished, and we need to create a balance. How do these people, and they are in the majority, you would hear people say, we have a decision to make, to be killed by hunger or to be killed by COVID-19, and both of them are viruses for them. So I think it's a challenge. And in societies, we haven't gotten there yet, but in developed societies, there are mechanisms for supporting your citizens. There are mechanisms for providing feeding. There is mechanism in a national, indeed international emergency and pandemic as we have today. There are mechanisms for cushioning the effect on citizens, and we don't have it here. And forget the story about the palliatives. The palliatives are for how many? The president was saying he wants it escalated to 3 million. You have a population of 200 million Nigerians. Those 3 million are not sufficient to address the challenge that the rest of Nigerians face. And people are dying out of hunger, not just COVID-19. So it means that we have to, this is an important opportunity for us to go back to the drawing board and find out what is the mechanism for setting up social welfare schemes for Nigerians, for those who don't have a job. If, God forbid, we do have this protract for so long, a lot of people are already in challenge. And you look at, I was listening to the statement by the Minister of Labor yesterday asking, listening to the directive, and you mentioned that in your news broadcast, the president asking for the SGF to implement the Oronsaya report. Now, implementing Oronsaya report at this time, and I'm not saying it's not an excellent report, but beginning to implement it at this time means that you are going to have to throw into the unemployment market hundreds of thousands of Nigerians. Is this a good time to do so? So I think there's just so much that is quite sad for us as Nigerians to see that our government, and I'm not talking of any particular government, but our government is unable to come to our aid in a situation of crisis such as we have today.
Well, we do hear from the Minister of Labour that this is not meant to result in job losses when you talk about the Orosoye report. But still on, cases of human rights violation, one particular one of possible human rights violation is the repatriation of Almajiri across states. I mean, that has been in the news for a while, and there's been so much controversy about it. But when you look at that case, do you see rights violations there?
There is incredible rights violation. And if you do have a central government, a federal government that is active, states should be called to order. What you are simply doing is dispersing the spread of COVID-19. And if you can see the reports coming, Almajiris who were taken from Kano to Jigawa to Kaduna and the rest of the states are becoming dispersers of COVID-19. A responsible system of government should not allow for citizens to be deported from one state to the other. If there are citizens in your domain, in a particular state who are infected, it is irresponsible of any governor to order their deportation to their so-called states of origin. If we watch what is going on, the international community have hired flights to take their citizens out of several capitals across the world. And we've seen that in Nigeria, British Airways moving citizens out of Nigeria, moving citizens out of several other countries around the world back home. Nobody is saying when you arrive as a British citizen, we would deport you or make sure that you go to your particular country or nation in the United Kingdom. People get in, and they're not even saying we should quarantine you. So there are certain rights as a citizen that you have. And it doesn't matter if a person is infected and is located and resident in any particular state. That state has a responsibility to take care of every person who is a citizen resident in their domain.
But, much as that may be the case, some say, albeit in an ideal situation, but this, they think it isn't ideal. The governors in question say, look, they've met, they've seen data, they've seen enough materials, statistics to show that if we don't deal with this matter, it may just come back and bite us behind. Because, we even heard the SGF say, look, this is a huge problem. If we don't address it headlong, it just may come back and have very, very dire consequences. So those examples you cited appear to have been completely different from the scenarios they face here. So what would you say to them if they say, look, we're acting based on what we have seen, the projections that we're seeing. Are we going to put human rights far above other people's welfare? Because if we don't deal with this, tomorrow the same people will blame us for not taking actions.
No, it's actually even detrimental to the rights of people that you take persons who may be infected from one state and move them to a different location where there may be no infections. Now, the whole idea is that if any person is infected in any part of Nigeria, it's a concern of everybody who is a citizen of Nigeria, and it is a concern of every government.
If I could just jump in,
Nigeria.
Mr. Wanko, just a minute. It wasn't actually intended to take those who are infected and move them on, because there's even this controversy now. Some, I think, from Kano, where they were tested, saying, look, we tested, we didn't see any of this. But if you were saying you saw it, it's to guard against them becoming an army that the nation or those states will not be able to handle eventually.
Well, the whole issue of Almajiris is a long-held problem in this country, and it's only recently, and perhaps one of the consequences or fallouts of COVID-19, that people are beginning to understand that the Almajiri system is unacceptable. You've got to send children to the right schools. You've got to send children to proper education. And it is beginning to be recognized now that the Almajiri system is inimical to our economic and social development. This is not the time to begin to ostracize Almajiri children and begin to identify what states they come from and move them in that direction. And I can bet you a whole lot of people being moved to particular states, supposedly their states, may actually not even be from those states. So I think that what is going on in terms of supposedly deporting Almajiris is irresponsible. And I think that the central government, the federal government, needs to call states to order. If states need help, and again, that's even the most important thing, states are sitting back, folding their hands, and expecting the federal government to take responsibility for dealing with COVID-19. Every state has responsibility to deal with this issue, to put resources to this. It's not about building structures and putting beds in there when you are doing absolutely nothing. The federal government is being questioned about palliatives. What are the state governments doing? State governments get resources. What are they doing with those resources? How are they helping persons resident in their states to cope with the crisis? And you look at the example of Lagos State, for instance, which is commendable. Maybe not enough, but commendable. What are other states doing? How many states are putting in resources to deal with the crisis that we have? Rather than finding scapegoats and moving people and deporting people in this circumstance, in this time, I think that any state government that is deporting citizens at this time is very, very irresponsible. And the federal government needs to take action to stop such irresponsibility.
You know, this reminds me of this conversation, I think it was last year, about personal rights and national security. Maybe this time it's national health security. And I'm sure you've been following the talk about the Control of Infectious Diseases Bill 2020, which is another example of, you know, the conversation around, you know, personal rights and, you know, collective rights. I'm sure you've seen the representations. I mean, yesterday there was a trend about stop NCDC bill. Some others said, you know, let's pass the NCDC bill. But when you look at that bill, how do we ensure that we represent personal rights and collective rights?
First of all, I mentioned that the Quarantine Act, under which the president has issued regulations at this time, is a 1918 law, and that tells you how old the law is. It's about 92 years old, so it needs to have changed. We got that law from the UK, and it was brought in at a time that you had a pandemic in that period. That law has, a lot has happened since then. For instance, the Quarantine Act did not even mention persons who enter a country or our country by air. It wasn't anticipated then that people would travel by air, and the law has changed. So I think it's important to review the Quarantine Act, and I think the sponsors of the bill need to be commended for coming up with a review. The question is, I think for a lot of people, what are the specific contents of it? And I have no problem with the bill. I just question the process. I think that for such a very monumental bill, because I've read every single clause in that bill, and there are far-reaching provisions in that bill that means that it needs to be discussed and debated publicly to know exactly what is there and what should not be there. The Constitution already allows for curtailment or derogation on rights in respect of public health matters and indeed several other issues. So there must be a law that is subject to scrutiny. Several provisions of the law raise concerns, indeed raise questions about the extent of powers given to the NCDC without judicial review, without administrative review. And I think for a lot of us, that's really what the issue is, not whether the law is needed or not. Yes, the law is needed, and the legislators who have proposed this law should be commended for proposing it. But let's have the opportunity to discuss the law, look at what it is that derogates on human rights. For instance, provisions giving the NCDC powers to designate a building to be a public health hazard and to destroy such a building. Those are very enormous powers, and these are personal buildings, not public buildings. The whole issue of ostracization or stigmatization is re-emphasized in the bill, because the bill says that you can mark a building as a building that, and this includes personal buildings, that are transmitters or could be infected buildings. The bill also does not recognize the crisis of housing that this country is faced with, and it's saying that the NCDC can designate a particular building to be overcrowded. Please, there are millions of buildings in this country that are overcrowded, and in an era or challenge of COVID-19 or indeed any other infectious disease, you would have to designate millions of buildings in this country as overcrowded and open or subject to destruction. So there is quite a lot that is of concern in the bill, and I would urge the sponsors of the bill, the chambers of the National Assembly, to open the bill up for public debate and discussion, so that we can have a bill that is acceptable to everyone. But indeed, it is a good initiative that bill is being proposed.
Issues to consider in that bill, but it's just other issue also. From next week, the lockdown has been relaxed and it's been phased over time from the recommendations that the PTF has made. And then that's also going to call to question maybe some human rights in some cases, because there is a total lockdown on interstate travel, and we're supposed to observe certain curfews. How do you see us implementing that?
The president, under the current Quarantine Act, has powers to issue regulations, and the regulations have been issued prohibiting interstate travel, and exceptions are made, and it's really for those who must travel to apply for exemption under those exceptions. So I think that we do have a public health concern at this time. It is very serious. It is very devastating. The world is reporting serious consequences as a result of the ravage of COVID-19. And I think that where regulations are made and where exemptions are provided in cases of emergency, people should apply for that if they must. It is quite heartening to see, for instance, in Lagos State, the governor issuing further directives to say that people can bury their dead. This is really very good, but again, these are subject to certain conditions. There are things that must happen even in a situation such as we have, such as burials, and these are exemptions that need to be made, and people may actually want to travel for those kinds of purposes. So exemptions could be provided. But overall, I think it calls on a lot of discipline on Nigerians to understand that we are dealing with a major crisis at this time. The world is suffering. This country is suffering. We have to deal with COVID-19, but even more frightening is what we have to deal with now and post-COVID-19, which is the economic crisis that this country is currently facing and will escalate post-COVID-19.
Okay, then, so we'll see what happens eventually. How will they implement this when everybody hits the road? But we do thank you for talking to us this morning, Mr. Clement Wankwo, Executive Director of PLAC.
Thank you.
We will be back in a moment. Stay with us.